Hello and welcome to this IELTS academic writing preparation video. Today we are going to go through a lesson that is a bit different than most of the academic preparation videos you might see. Today we're going to focus on analyzing and writing about tables. Now, many students prepare for IELTS academic writing prompts by focusing on pie charts and line graphs and bar graphs, and then when they get to the exam, they realize that sometimes tables are included in the question. So in some cases, you might see a pie chart or a line or bar graph with a table. That could happen. It is quite a difficult question. But what we're going to do in this video today is start off and get used to analyzing tables on their own. So we're going to look at two different examples of tables. We're going to focus on a structure and preparation that we can use for analyzing tables and then writing about them. And I hope you'll follow along with me today because grouping data on tables can actually be quite tricky. So we are going to give you some foolproof tips and tricks and a couple of examples that we can work through together so that you are prepared for the possibility of seeing a table in your writing prompt. Let's get started and look directly at the general guide that we're going to use today when we write our essay. And it is pretty straightforward. There are two steps. And step one is going to ask you to analyze the table and plan how to group the information. And then step two is going to be writing an essay using the recommended essay structure. Now, the essay structure is quite simple, and we recommend that you use it for most of the writing task 1 questions because it's very logical and will get you maximum points on your coherence and cohesion. We'll talk about that later. First, I want to focus on step 1 because there are two sub-steps, I like to call them, when it comes to step 1. So it is an overarching general step. You're going to analyze the table, plan out how to group the information, and you want to pay attention to these two sub-steps. We have A and B. First off, we're going to organize the information into two categories. You want two categories because it will make things easier when you write your essay. I'll talk about that in our example in just a moment. And then once you organize the information, you're going to describe the key information from each category. So you're not going to talk about every piece of information that you find from your table, but you're going to think about what stands out to you. So we'll have to find this information that stands out, and we must be selective. The one thing about tables is that there is usually a lot of data to get through in a table, and you don't want to write about every piece. You want to be selective. So this is usually going to require us to look at the highest and the lowest values, and this is usually what we're going to put into our essay. So without further ado, let's go ahead and look at our writing prompt for today and focus on step 1 with these two sub-steps, A and B, in mind. Okay, here is our writing prompt for today. So I'm going to read the prompt and then we'll look at the table together. It says, the table below gives average yearly weather statistics of 4 cities. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. All right, and here we see everything we'll need to know for our table. So we've got our 4 cities, Edinburgh, Paris, Helsinki, and Casablanca. And the average statistics for these cities in terms of annual rainfall, number of wet days, annual snowfall, annual temperature range, and hours of sunlight per day. Like I said earlier, there is a ton of information here. We've got millimeters, number of days, snowfall again in millimeters, degrees, hours of sunlight. There's really so much. And the difficult part about writing an essay with a table is this limit we have right here. We have to write at least 150 words, but we'll definitely be able to write 150 words. We don't want to write too much over. So that is the difficult thing. We don't want to write too much and take time away from the other tasks in the writing section. So let's learn how to be concise. And a great way to do that is by using this handy step 1 So you'll see here that I have the first grouping and the second grouping. This is because we are going to put the first grouping in our body paragraph 1 and the second grouping in our body paragraph 2. I will talk about the outline later. Right now, I just want to focus on analyzing this table and understanding how we are going to get 2 groups out of all of this information. So first, it's important to look at this first column here. This shows the categories of information. So we see there are 5 categories. We've got total annual rainfall, number of wet days, annual snowfall, annual temperature range, and hours of sunlight per day. We need to see if these categories have anything in common so that we can group them together. This is the first thing you should be looking at. What do these categories have in common? So if we look at the first 3, the total annual rainfall, number of wet days, and annual snowfall, these can actually be grouped together. Why? They all have a form of precipitation. So precipitation is basically any form of wetness which falls from the sky, like rain or snow. And you may be thinking that that is quite a stretch. How did we think of this so quickly? And basically, it's just a lot of practice, knowing your vocabulary, and being able to think critically. So the fact that we see rain, wet, and snow, it brings to mind precipitation, and that is why I have decided to put these in one group. So in this case, I'm going to call the first grouping my precipitation group. And so we can group these 3 things together. And that makes it quite easy for us because the second group is going to be our second columns here, the last 2 that we have left, and that is annual temperature range and hours of sunlight per day. So let's call this one the heat difference and sunny hours. And you see, these things don't really have that much in common, but that's fine. It's really important that our first group here has a lot in common in terms of wetness and precipitation. So we can just add this second grouping because these are the 2 categories that are left: heat difference and sunny hours. Okay, so we have done the first part. We've analyzed the table and we've planned how to group the information. Now it's time for step 2, which, if you remember, is describing key information from each category. And this is quite tricky. It can be difficult because you see, we have a ton of information here. Now, it's really important to be selective. And so you don't want to write about every piece of data you see here. Again, that's going to be too long. You're going to write way more than 150 words in that case. So to find out what information stands out, you can look at the highest value and the lowest value for each category. And so let's take a look at this table and understand the highest and the lowest categories. First off, when we look at total annual rainfall, we see that Paris has 700 millimeters. That's the highest value. And then the lowest value is going to be here at Casablanca, which has 26 millimeters. Now, this is for each year. So I have highlighted essentially the highest and the lowest. If we look at the number of wet days, the highest is Helsinki, so I'm going to pay attention to that. Again, the lowest is in Casablanca, so we see that that is 5. If we look at the annual snowfall, we're going to do the same thing, and we see Helsinki has 450 millimeters, and Casablanca has 0. So here you can already start to see a trend in that Casablanca has the lowest amount of rainfall, number of wet days, and the lowest amount of annual snowfall. Continuing on, if we look at the annual temperature range, the lowest, pay attention to this, is -10 to +18 degrees. So again, that's going to be Helsinki at, in this case, the lowest temperature, and the highest temperature is going to be Casablanca, just because it goes up into 35 degrees Celsius. Paris only goes to 25 degrees Celsius, so I would hit Casablanca as the highest here. And then the hours of sunlight per day, we've got the lowest, strangely enough, in Edinburgh, and then the highest in Casablanca. Now, again, like I said, you're going to see that there is this overall trend with Casablanca and that it is one of the most extreme out of all the cities in some way or another. We're going to talk about the overview in step 2. So for now, let's just focus on this key information. It's very important to do this because basically we can eliminate talking about any of these data points in black. You want to focus on the data points in red. Now, I would definitely do this step when you're analyzing your table. Just to make it clear for everyone, I'm going to write some key points in this table that I'm using. When you are writing your actual essay, this is definitely helpful, but it is optional. As long as you understand your table and you somehow mark the extreme pieces of data, you are more than likely going to have understood the table. But I'm still going to make some points here for myself. I am going to talk about Paris and the high rainfall at 700 millimeters. I am going to talk about Helsinki when it comes to the snowfall at 450 millimeters, because interestingly, that is 4 times as much snow than any other city. So I'm definitely going to include that. I'm going to talk about Helsinki and the rainy days, because that is at 181 number of wet days. And from all this information, I am going to talk about how Casablanca has a very minuscule amount of rainfall and absolutely no snowfall. So I am going to say Casablanca, small amount of rainfall, and no snow, okay? Now, of course, you'll notice that this is definitely not the best grammar. It might not make sense to anyone else, but I'm just going to use it for my own purposes when writing the essay. Again, I would suggest doing this in one way or another. Just make sure you don't skip out on understanding your table. Now for the heat difference and sunny hours, I'm just going to make some notes here as well. And basically what I really want to talk about here is that Casablanca and Helsinki have a very wide margin. So I'm going to say Helsinki and Casablanca temperatures vary by about 28 for Helsinki and 26 for Casablanca degrees. And I got these because I was looking at 10 and 18 and 35 minus 9. So we're getting about 28 degrees here and 26 degrees here. So I'll talk about Casablanca's sunny hours at 9 because that is the highest of all of the cities. And I do also want to talk about Edinburgh because they only have 4 hours, so it is the lowest. I'll probably add something in here about Paris just to include it a little bit and also perhaps talk about the difference between Casablanca and Paris when I write my essay here. So I'll just include a note for myself. And there you have it. That is step 1. Now remember, step 1 has 2 sub-steps. So you can think of this first one as A, and then this second one here as B, describing key information. And we have just done this. Now you may be thinking that this is very time consuming. And while it does take time to get used to this format and understand the data, with more practice, you will be able to perfect this and do so in a very quick way. Of course, right now I was taking it a bit slower just so that we were able to understand everything together, but this should not take more than 1 or 2 minutes, especially when you're able to underline or draw attention to the highest and the lowest pieces of data. Now I'm going to just remind you about step 2. We're going to talk briefly about looking at an overall trend, and then we're going to start writing this essay. Okay, now just to remind you of our guide, step 2 is going to be writing an essay using the recommended essay structure. Before we do that, there is one bonus step, I like to call it, and that is summarizing the overall trend. Now in our first step, we looked at our 2 groupings and we looked at specifics. When we summarize the overall trend, we are really just summarizing the overview of the main groupings. So we do not mention specifics. And this is actually going to go in the beginning of our essay, right after the introduction. It really just takes a few seconds. In fact, we already pretty much did it when we looked at our first step, focusing specifically on Casablanca and looking at the extreme trends. This is just going to be a couple of sentences about the overview. And so, in this case, it makes sense to look at the paragraphs we're going to be using. Like I said, first we're going to have an introduction, then we're going to have a small overview paragraph, third we'll have a body paragraph, and then a body paragraph 2. Now I want to tell you what goes in these specific paragraphs. In the introduction, we are going to paraphrase the task question. So this means we're going to say the task question in a different way. This is where our synonyms and our vocabulary will really come in handy. Then for number 2, for the overview, we're going to write a general overview of the main groupings, just as I explained. I'll walk you through this before we start writing the essay in the next step. Then in the body paragraph 1, we are going to talk about the first grouping in a logical way. And we're going to use details here. So we are going to use details in the body paragraphs, not the overview. And our body paragraph 1, in our case for the first example, is going to be all about the precipitation group. Then, you guessed it, body paragraph 2 is going to be all about the second grouping. And in our case, that is going to be about the heat difference and sunny hours group. So you see how this is very clear. We've got these 4 distinct paragraphs. They each serve a different purpose, and this will make sure that we are including all of the necessary information without writing too much. And one last thing I want to make sure you know before we start writing the essay is the scoring. So we have our task achievement, which will basically ask you to make sure you're fulfilling the task itself. So answering the question, staying at a minimum of 150 words and not going too far over that. And then we have coherence and cohesion. And the outline that I just showed you will really help make sure that you are getting maximum points here, because everything will flow in a logical way. You don't want to just start with information about the first grouping, for example, and then end with a paraphrased task question. That wouldn't make sense. So if you follow that guide, you are going to be hitting all of the main points, and your reader will really understand the logic you used for writing your essay. Third, your lexical resource. This has everything to do with the vocabulary you choose and the words you write, as well as their accuracy and spelling. And then, of course, our grammar. So our grammatical range and accuracy is also something to keep in mind. Make sure you are using the correct tenses, present perfect, past tense, future perfect. Really try to add in some advanced level grammar and vocabulary so that your score here can be maximized. Okay, so with that being said, we've looked at the scoring, we've looked at our outline. Now I want to take you to the general overview, and then we're going to start writing. And just briefly, I want to walk you through this overview and the overall trend. As we saw from before, Helsinki and Casablanca both have this wide range in temperature and the amount of annual rain. So basically what we see here is that Helsinki has the most rainy days, by far the most snow, and Helsinki and Casablanca experience much wider temperature differences. So I'm just going to say here, Helsinki has the most rainy days, and then I'll say Helsinki and Casablanca experience wide differences. And I'll elaborate on this when I'm actually writing the paragraph. And then I am going to talk about how Casablanca differs from the rest of the cities because it is the warmest, driest, and has the most sunny hours. So you note how I'm not really talking about Paris and Edinburgh that much in my overview. I will most likely mention Paris when I talk about the annual rainfall, just because it's an interesting contrast to the number of wet days that Helsinki has. But I'm not focusing on this data in black. I'm focusing on the high and low points in red. So just make sure that you are aware of this. Again, I just wrote this down, but we had already talked about it when we looked at step 1 and A and B. So I'm going to start writing. I've included these headings just for you. Of course, you definitely do not want to use these when you're writing your own essay. I'm just doing this for clarity and to make sure that everything makes sense for us. So I'm going to start with the introduction. which remember is just a paraphrase sentence or two about the writing prompt. You don't want to spend too much time here. So quite simply, I'm going to say the table provided shows information regarding annual weather conditions for Edinburgh, Paris, Helsinki, and Casablanca. And that is really all you need here. Really nothing else is listed. We're just going to look at this sentence because the rest of the prompt is telling us what to do. So instead of saying the table below, I've said the table provided. Instead of saying gives average yearly weather statistics, I've said shows information regarding annual weather conditions. So you want to use different words when you can. This will show the examiner that you are able to utilize your vocabulary and that you can come up with synonyms. So with that being done, let's go ahead and move to our overview paragraph. So I'm going to talk about this trend, and I'm going to start off by saying, overall, although Paris has the most annual rain in millimeters, Helsinki has the most rainy days and by far the most snow. So I did say I was going to mention Paris briefly just because of this contrast, and it's nice to link up different ideas. So I'm contrasting the fact that Paris has the most annual rainfall, yet Helsinki has the highest number of wet days. Now I'm going to talk about Helsinki and Casablanca here. So I'll say Helsinki and Casablanca experience much wider temperature differences than other cities. Then I'm going to talk about Casablanca specifically, and I'll say Casablanca differs from the other cities the most, as it is the warmest, driest, and experiences far more sunny hours. And that is exactly what we saw earlier in the trend in red. So I've included the pertinent information there. Now we're going to talk about body paragraph 1, and we're going to use this information here in our table in the precipitation group. So I'm going to start off by saying, in terms of precipitation, Paris has the highest rainfall at 700 millimeters. I'm writing it exactly as I see it in the table. I don't really have to write out the word, so this is perfect. Then I'll say, and Helsinki has more than 4 times as much snow as any other city at 450 millimeters, which is what I had here in the table. Now I'm going to talk about the rainy days. So if I say, looking at the figure for rainy days specifically, Helsinki has the most days of rain at 181 days. In a stark contrast to other cities, Casablanca has a minuscule rainfall of 26 millimeters per annum, only 5 rainy days, and no snow. Now, I will talk about the language I use and the vocabulary words after, but right now, I just want to make sure that I'm writing everything that I talked about earlier in the preparation stage. So we mentioned Paris, we mentioned Helsinki with snowfall, 4 times the amount of snow, Casablanca with a small amount of rainfall. Everything here makes sense, and we have pretty much exhausted the information for the precipitation group. So we can go on and finish with our body paragraph 2. Remember, that is all about the heat difference and sunny hours. So I'm going to say, as far as heat difference and sunny hours are concerned, Helsinki and Casablanca's temperatures can vary wildly by a very similar margin. And this is where I want to talk about the 28 and the 26 degrees that we looked at here. So I'm going to elaborate and say Helsinki's by 28 degrees Celsius and Casablanca's by 26 degrees Celsius. Moreover, Casablanca's 9 sunny hours per day far exceed that of the next sunniest city, which is Paris, with 6.5 hours. And remember, I wanted to include the fact that Casablanca has 9 sunny hours, and I did think about mentioning Paris at 6.5 just because it's the next highest. So I've just added that in here briefly. And I want to close by saying Edinburgh is the least sunny with only 4 hours of sunshine. And there it is. So I have kept the numbers the same, obviously. I've kept my millimeters the same as they have it in the table just to keep everything consistent. And I included all of the necessary information in terms of the body paragraphs, yet I talked about the overall trend, which is exactly what you want to do in the overview paragraph. So now I'm going to clean this up for us, and we're going to focus on the grammar, the lexical resource, and some really interesting words and linking phrases that I can use to make my essay flow. All right, and here is the finished product. So I have synonyms and topic vocabulary in blue. These are all things that pertain to weather and that we used to talk about what we saw in the table. So you'll see annual rain, rainy days, temperature differences, sunny hours. Precipitation was a big one because that really was the main group that we had. So that word came in very handy. Then we had, again, rainy days, heat difference, and sunny hours, which was our second grouping. This was also important to see because sunlight gives us the idea for sunny hours, and we saw the difference in heat. And then again, we have sunny hours and sunny and sunshine. So it's very important to know the noun versus the adjective. So the noun sunshine versus the adjective sunny, for example. Now, if we look at green, these are useful vocabulary and phrases. So differs from, minuscule, which means extremely small or tiny, can vary widely by, far exceed, and the least. Now, these really come in handy in this specific example, but you can reuse these in other writing prompts because they are things that pertain to data or analytical or scientific writing. So definitely make note of this and make sure you're keeping a tab of helpful vocabulary and phrases that you can use. This goes for the red as well. So overall is a great way to introduce your overview paragraph. In terms of is excellent when you want to become specific like we need to be in body paragraph 1, as much as is a great way to compare two things. So we saw Helsinki has more than 4 times as much snow as any other city. And these are just great grammar points. This is also a grammar point, but it's also great for a functional word. So just make sure you are aware of your comparisons and contrasting things, especially for tables. And speaking of that, we have in a stark contrast to. This is great when you want to contrast 2 or more things. Then for our last paragraph here, as far as something or some things are concerned, this is very similar to in terms of, because you're becoming specific and you have a whole paragraph about that, but you don't want to repeat the words that you used. So it's nice to change it up a bit. And then lastly, our word count is 204 words. That's great. We definitely fulfilled the 150 word mark, and we elaborated where necessary. So this is an excellent example of how to really maximize your table. Make sure you're being broad enough in your overview paragraph and specific enough in your body paragraphs, and always pay attention to your language. Now let's look at the second example. I'm going to take things a bit quicker. We'll do the prep stage together and then analyze the essay as well. Now this is different in that we have dates. However, the idea is still the same. So let's go ahead and take a look at the prompt. It says, the table below shows data about underground railway systems in 6 major cities with date opened, kilometers of route, and passenger numbers per year in millions. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. So again, the only thing that is really different in this example is that we have dates and we have a whole different idea. Do not let this confuse you because you still want to do everything exactly like we did before. So with that being said, we have our step 1, analyze the table and plan how to group the information right here. Now it is a bit tricky when trying to understand how to group 2 groupings this information. There really isn't anything that calls out at you, but that's why a lot of practice and analytical skills will really come in handy here. You might be thinking of looking at passengers per year, perhaps those that have the highest amount of passengers versus the lowest. You could also be looking at kilometers of route. However, I would look at the date opened, because this will give you 2 groups. It'll be quite simple in terms of the date. So the older and the newer underground railway systems. If you were to do it in a different way, the groupings wouldn't really make sense. So if you're looking here, for example, at the passengers per year, the difference between 50 million and 775 million, these are too vast, and it doesn't really make sense to group information on numbers that are just so outrageous. That's why using the date is the best option here. And that is the same for kilometers. So you notice how 11 and 28 are sort of outliers. It wouldn't make sense to do a group with just these 2 and a group with these other higher numbers and higher amounts. So in this case, this is why date opened is the best way to go. It's very simple. You can do new versus old underground railway systems, and it makes sense. It's also easier on you so that you don't have to worry so much about these numbers. So we see from the table that there are 3 cities with railway systems that are very old, and that is London, Paris, and Tokyo. So that will be our first grouping. Okay, so I'm going to write here 3 cities with railway systems that are very old, and then I'll make a note of London, Paris, and Tokyo. I'll just put the abbreviations here. And that means the second grouping is going to be 3 cities that have a newer system. And that's going to be Washington, D.C., Kyoto, and L.A. And so that is our first part of step 1. Now we'll have to describe key information from each category. So remember, we want to look at things that stand out. So first off, I'm going to look at the date opened. I'm going to pick the date that is the farthest in the past, so the oldest date, and that is 1863. And then I'm going to look at the newest date, which is 2001. This is the most recent. When we come to kilometers, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to look at the largest number, which is 394 kilometers, and the smallest, which would be 11. And then with passengers per year in millions, same idea. So we are going to look at 45. Now remember, these are in millions. It doesn't really matter though, that doesn't change anything. I'm still going to make a note of the lowest number and the highest number here. So now for our first grouping, I'm just going to make some notes here. I'm going to talk about London, obviously, with the date 1863, which is the oldest. I'm also going to talk about the 394 kilometers. Then I think I'll talk about Paris, which was opened in 1900. So I'll also mention this. And then I will just make some notes about Tokyo and the amount of passengers that it has, because again, that is one of our highlighted figures. And that all pertains to our first grouping. Our second grouping, I'm going to do something very similar. I'm going to talk about the longest route of the 3. And now I haven't necessarily highlighted this in red. However, if I'm looking from Washington, D.C., Kyoto, and Los Angeles, the route that is the longest would be Washington, D.C.'s. So I am going to make a note of that since I'm comparing these 3 cities. I do want to note that Kyoto has the smallest amount, 11. And then I will talk about Los Angeles because that opened in 2001 and it has 28 kilometers of track. Also, I do want to mention the fact that Kyoto serves 45 million passengers per year, which is the smallest amount. Okay, and there you have it. That is the main information. I've identified key things, but notice how it becomes easier once you're able to separate your information into two groups. Now, before I show you the essay, I just want to go over the overall trend because that is important as well. Basically here, there isn't really anything new to add. I'm just going to open up and talk about how London and Paris have the oldest systems. And I'm going to talk about passengers in Tokyo versus those in Kyoto because it is the highest versus the lowest. So there isn't really anything else to add in terms of a trend. And you see in this example, we had already figured it out when we looked at the data. All right, so that is all the preparation work. Now I'm going to show you the essay and we're going to analyze it for its language and its organization. Okay, and here's the finished product. So we're going to start right here with our introduction paragraph. I'll read it and I will highlight any of the important words and we'll talk about some of the synonyms. So it says, the table illustrates data regarding underground railways from 6 large cities in various parts of the world, showing year opened, kilometers of route, and yearly passenger numbers in millions. And that is exactly what we see here. Now, instead of saying shows data, I said illustrates data. Instead of saying about, I said regarding. And after that, I kept everything else pretty much the same. In this case, you just want to open up your essay and describe what is happening. In the overview paragraph, I said overall, London and Paris have the oldest underground train system in the world compared to Los Angeles, which is relatively new. Passengers for Tokyo are the highest, in contrast to Kyoto, which has the lowest number of yearly passengers and the shortest route. Now here, overall is a great functional word that serves for a general paragraph. Compared to is excellent when you want to compare two things. And in contrast to, you guessed it, is great when you want to contrast two things. And of course, I have underground train here. Instead of saying underground railway, I've had a synonym here, underground train, which is the same thing, but would just show the examiner that I have brushed up on my synonyms and my vocabulary. And of course, useful vocabulary has the lowest number of. In general, anything with comparison and contrasting or superlatives is going to work really well with a table question. So make sure that you have brushed up on those. Now in our body paragraph 1, we see in terms of older railway systems, the London Underground, which opened in 1863, is the oldest network. It is also the most extensive with 394 kilometers of route. The railway system in Paris, which was opened in 1900, is approximately half the size and serves more passengers. Finally, the underground in Tokyo is the busiest of the three with 1,928 million passengers yearly and 155 kilometers of route. And again, I've got in terms of, for something that is specific, finally, to put things in a chronological order or to make my notes ordinal. This gives some order to my paragraph. And of course, I just wanted to include the information that I had in my table and make sure that everything was specific as possible without going overboard. Now, paragraph 2 says, regarding the 3 other newer railway systems, Washington, D.C. has the longest route of the 3. On the contrary, Kyoto has only 11 kilometers of route and the lowest passenger numbers of all the cities, with 45 million passengers yearly. Following this, Los Angeles, which opened in 2001, has 28 kilometers of track and serves 50 million passengers per year. Here again, regarding is an excellent way to shift and talk about something else in a specific way. On the contrary is a great way to introduce a contrasting argument. And following this is very similar to finally. It's basically saying next or then. And again, just giving an order to your paragraph. And then passenger numbers and track are also vocabulary that are relevant to this topic. Again, I was just thinking of numbers of passengers, and track is another way to talk about a route. So in general, remember to follow this outline. Use your body paragraphs to your advantage and use the information in your table to your advantage by including relevant dates, relevant numbers, and compare and contrast as necessary. Again, that's going to be very important for your table questions. And overall, this was 201 words. So it's perfect. We've definitely fulfilled our minimum of 150 words, and we haven't gone too far overboard. Lastly, don't let any sort of dates confuse you or 5 or 6 categories. Just sit with the information for a bit and understand how you can arrange them into 2 groups. All right, great job. Let's go ahead and wrap up this lesson. Let's look at some do's and don'ts when working with tables. First off, for things you want to do, you do want to analyze your table before writing. Obviously, you want to know what you are writing about. And it's very important that you do this because you need to understand your categories. We saw that the most difficult thing today was categorizing 5 or 6 things into 2 groups. So that's why you really need to sit with the information, practice, and look for relevant themes that will help you categorize the information. Then once you do that, you want to plan how to describe the information by looking at specific details. We looked at the highest and the lowest amounts of various things, and this is a good way to go. Then understand your overall trends. This will be important for your overview paragraph, and that will really help when you organize your essay. You want to have those very clear paragraphs of the introduction, overview, and body paragraphs 1 and 2. Things that you don't want to do, definitely don't start writing the essay immediately. You need to take some time to plan out the information. Again, I took my time with you today, and you should take your time when you practice just so that you can get better at this skill. But the more that you practice, the more you'll be able to do the prep work in just a few minutes. But trust me, it makes the difference because it will help you plan out your essay, and you'll be calm, collected, and ready to write. With that being said, don't write the wrong amount. Table essays tend to get a bit longer, so you definitely want to make sure you are fulfilling your requirement of 150 words, but you shouldn't be going too far over 200. So our essays today were at 200, and that's a good place to be. The one thing you could do with table analysis that would be really bad is to write too much. So make sure you are able to control the amount that you're writing. Remember, you don't want to write about every single piece of data, just the relevant and specific things. And then, of course, you don't want to group your categories strangely or in a way that doesn't make sense. So think about our second example. We had a couple of options when it came to numbers and amounts, but they didn't make sense. So we ended up going with dates just because that was the one that made the most sense to us in terms of old and new. So don't make things overly difficult for yourself, but again, practice will make perfect. Thanks again for joining me. You did a great job. I hope you will continue on practicing and visit us at www.bestmytest.com/IELTS. Here we've got a lot of great practice tests and other lessons for IELTS writing and more. So be sure to check us out. Thanks again. Have a great day.